Which one did you get?
The Moderna.
Moderna.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was just what was available at the time. And yeah, that ended up being quite a turning point because at first I was so relieved that I'm like, okay, this decision is now behind me, right? I've done it. It's okay. We're good. I expected that night was going to be a little messy. Most people knew that there was, or at least you're set up to understand that the symptoms that you get in that night are, going to be a little rough. You might have a bad sleep. Generally speaking, I didn't have as good a sleep as I normally would, but it was fine. It was until the days later that things started to change.
How?
Yeah, I'm one of those, as I joked with other people, one of those lucky lottery winners that turns out this is a pretty high odds lottery, but lucky lottery winners that had an injury from the vaccine. It was. I'll put it this way: it sucked in many ways, and we might get more into it as we go through this. But I was quite fortunate relative to other people, and that's a perspective I try to keep in my mind, even though it would be difficult any given day to do so. But yeah, I had a very eclectic mix of symptoms. So the first bit was this sort of unbearable fatigue. So you mentioned I'm pretty active. So during the course of the day, I will go to the gym kind of at that time I was going in the afternoon. So I'd go midday if work was going well, didn't have any other things. I'd go to the gym and then just pick up work afterwards. There was one day about 4 days later, I started noticing just like subtle symptoms of fatigue and even just like tightness in upper chest. But then I started like, oh, maybe it's just my workout, right? So I eased up a little bit. And then 6 or 7 days in, I came home from a work. I was going to a workout. I already felt a little tired. During the workout, I was like, oh man, I really can't push today. This is weird. Maybe I just need to take it easy. And on the way back, I was so tired that I needed to message one of my colleagues and say, I'm sorry, I'm done for the rest of the day. I need to nap. And I've never had that urge before. It was just so overwhelming. And so I'm like, okay, maybe I'm burning myself out. It didn't make sense because it was the middle of summer and, stress levels were actually, relatively speaking, in the pandemic were pretty manageable at that point. But took some time off from the gym and was actually planning to go on a trip out to Western Canada for a conference I was going to on the Friday morning, and woke up that morning with what I thought was, well, for all intents and purposes, thought it might have been having a heart attack. My heart rate was not high, but for those who watch cartoons as a kid, it was as if my heart was like pushing through my rib cage, and it wasn't like I woke up from a dream that was because if that were the case, my heart rate would be high.
Yeah, it wasn't a panic attack.
No, and it wasn't going down. So I visited the ER. Didn't really get much other than just a bunch of tests. Nothing happened, and things did ease up after a little bit. But yeah, that was sort of the immediate phase one, and it continued.
It continued, and so forgive me.
Mm-hmm.
It took a long time in our regular meetings, which were over Zoom, but it took a long time for you to say enough and for me to notice enough to realize that something was going on with you. You were not talking. You may have been open about this, but you certainly weren't bringing it to the fore in a way that it became apparent to me. But if we, at the point that we finally had a completely clear discussion about the state of your health, you had become pretty visibly frail compared to what you had been before and what you are now. You were, so, what was your life like, and what was your day-to-day interaction with the new medical realities that you were facing?
Yeah, so I'd say there were two paths or two parallel paths I would articulate. One is the physical piece, to your point, and managing those symptoms. So I didn't know what was wrong with me, but I knew there was something wrong, and so I tried various things. You would go to your standard doctors in Canada. Fortunately, unfortunately, that may be another discussion topic for another day, but we have the ability to access healthcare in a basic sense, at least through the system that we have, without pulling out the credit card, so to speak. But test after test after test was coming back either negative or all within normal range, which became the bane of my existence, because I know my body pretty well and knew that
you knew something was going on and they weren't finding it.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it was one of those things where it came in different waves, but over time, the heart palpitations was something that would continue. The wave of fatigue was an issue. So it got to the point where 2.5 weeks after the dose, I took some time off after that ER visit as well. But about a week and a half after that, I basically stopped exercising other than walking for what ended up being almost a year.
All right. And we can go back and pick up whatever information we've glossed over. Sure. But at some point, you did say something about that you were facing a vaccine injury, and that you weren't sure what to do about it. Mm-hmm. And of course, at the point that crossed into my consciousness fully, I know exactly who to send you to. I know the people who specialize in treating vaccine injured people, and I know that they succeed at it because you're not the first person that I've sent. Right. But I said, hey, how about we set you up with Dr. Kory? And you were up for it. Of course, you had tried everything and nothing worked. So
right, I was up for almost anything at that point.
And so okay, you met up with Dr. Kory virtually, I assume. What happened next?
Yeah, and that was I'm always grateful for that introduction to him.
Well, I'm embarrassed that it didn't come earlier. I should have paid closer attention. But
regardless, so I was grateful for it nonetheless, and it happened, I think, April, May-ish, kind of 22. So at that point, to your point, I had gone through any number of different specialists and different testing and just straight up gaslighting from the medical system. I have many new opinions of the healthcare system that I didn't have before. But yeah, once I got to that point, he was incredibly helpful. I think one of the things I struggled with was not simply just the symptoms, because at that point, the symptoms were, I'd gotten into a groove where I could manage them. Now, I still wasn't exercising at that point, other than, again, just walking and stuff like that. But I had habits around sleep. I had habits around when I would eat and what I would eat, and very, very mindful of all of that. But to your point, I lost a lot of weight. I was probably, from where I am right now, I was at the lowest. I'm probably 25 pounds heavier now versus when I was there before. And I was eating healthy, so it wasn't fat. I was losing a fair amount of muscle.
Yeah, you looked like a different person.
Yeah. So, which also, you get to the point where you start getting conscious about that too, in terms of how you present, right? But I was virtual. I mean, in our conversation, certainly, but even from a work context, I was virtual. So you can kind of hide some of it. But I actually recall now bringing that up. I had a colleague who I hadn't seen in a while because I moved to a different team, and we met up, and she's just like, "Oh, man, like you've lost a lot of weight," in like sort of like a positive-ish sort of way.
Right.
And I kind of, just politely acknowledged it, and we moved on to the conversation. But that really kind of hit me, and I don't remember exactly when it was, but it was like, oh yeah, I experience it every day in a sort of incremental sense, but people who haven't seen me in that gap, it's really noticeable. But to your question, Dr. Kory was very helpful, both because I needed two things mainly. Number one, I needed somebody who actually knew what they were doing, right? And he did know what he was doing. But number two, and more importantly, I needed somebody who I trusted was actually going to do their homework, because I had cardiologists, to my earlier point, who basically said to me that, okay, we don't see anything on our tests, so this must be psychosomatic. And I'm like, first of all, you didn't ask any even basic triage questions to see whether I had any mental health challenge history, number one. Number two, even if that is what you think it's going to be, or it is, you should at least couch it with your patient as, you know what, I haven't really found what's going on here. sometimes there are scenarios where patients will be so anxious that physical symptoms will manifest. I want to rule that out. So help me with this sort of thing, right? There's a way to vary with a high level of EQ, so to speak, do that, right? But I got, no, it must be all in your head. I'm like, no, it is most certainly not all in my head. And if it were, well, not even if it were, it was not. And I know that because the contrast was so stark from pre to post. And it wasn't like I didn't want to, right. The fact that I couldn't play sports or do a lot of the activities that I was doing before, even just non-sports things that just extended my day too long. I'm like, no, I can't go too far because I'm going to be so wiped. And I didn't want to affect my job, because if I affected my job, then I couldn't pay for the extra healthcare that I need to pay out of pocket, among many other things. Right. So yeah, it's one of those things where Dr. Kory became someone who I could trust, that would actually do the homework, and then also as a treatment, because one of the hypotheses I had was that I had myocarditis. And I'll just say that according to him, it's very unlikely that's the case. Unfortunately, it's something that you need some pretty advanced tests to completely rule out. Yeah. But the test that I did do, plus the other things that he kind of took in clinically, he didn't feel like it was that. So the easiest way to describe it was like a very over-the-top autoimmune response.
Okay. So that's a powerful story. It's also, I will say, just the fact that it's not like you're describing, you got the shot, you started to feel anomalously terrible. You went to Dr. Kory, you started to feel better. Mm-hmm. You're visibly different. Mm-hmm. Right. So psychosomatic doesn't, it's not impossible that a person could imagine that they were better and change their behavior and all of that. But you were trying and it wasn't working. Right. And then Dr. Kory intervened medically. Right. And the transition is not only remarkable in its degree, but also remarkable in its speed. And you started reporting as I asked you, hey, how is that going? Mm-hmm. It wasn't like, hey, I'm better, he cured me. It's like, wow, this is going really well. Yeah. I'm amazed at how quickly I'm feeling a difference, which, all of this suggests an actual intervention that has physiological implications. Right. Okay, so I should also just say two things. One, it is important to me. I get accused of lots of stuff, as you know. The people who participate in the discussions that I host, the people who are on the Discord server, the people who circulate around DarkHorse, I do think it is likely that they are less vaccinated than average. If we were to just see who got shots and how many, less than average. But it is nothing like, oh, the people who circulate around DarkHorse didn't get them, right? Mm-hmm. Many, I think most probably got some. And this is far from the only story I know. And it's not just people who circulate around DarkHorse. Mm-hmm. I have friends, people I knew from long before COVID, who got shots and have very horrifying stories to tell. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of those cases. And I also, as I said, have seen people go to Dr. Kory finally out of desperation, and this is the report that I get is, wow, this is the first time, A, I've felt that the thing was being dealt with in a logical way, and B, the response is undeniable. So that's all very positive. I will say, just for people who may be having this experience, Dr. Kory now does telemedicine, and if you're in need of his help, I definitely suggest you get a consult. But, okay. The most important thing here is it's a little bit delicate, because obviously reputationally I have a lot riding on this, and that's part of why I've asked you to have this discussion. But certain things that you've said unprompted by me, I think are quite telling with respect to where you are now with your understanding of what happened during COVID, what the reality of the shots was, And maybe most importantly, where you think you would be if you hadn't had this terrible medical misfortune.
Yeah. Yeah. I described to folks that I would put myself in sort of a libertarian-ish disposition and political ideology prior to COVID, and still would be there to a large extent if I'm having to summarize. But the expectation I had of institutions was that, particularly in the COVID scenario, would be that they would inefficiently, clumsily, slowly get there almost to the right answer, right? And as I've said to you, I couldn't have been more wrong on that. That realization took months, years to really see. But I would say that those smaller pieces, I used the softball example earlier. It sounds very kind of mundane, but it is a little bit of a light bulb moment. It's a dimmer light bulb than the vaccine issue. But there were some of those types of moments that started adding up. But still, obviously, at that point, I still decided I'm going to go ahead with getting that shot. And yeah, it changed. And I think it's one of those things where had I either taken the shot and had no adverse event, or other sort of scenario, I could definitely see myself going down the route of many folks in the audience would be very aware of, from a podcast world perspective, and just others in your lives that are the quote unquote the normies, who would have said, look at those anti-vaxxers, vaccines are amazing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, I try not to be the person who is overtly, impolite and rude, but certainly from a thinking perspective, I would have been there for sure. And in fact, I was there and had certain things in addition to just the vaccine thing, which obviously a big one, but had other things not happened. Yeah, I could easily see myself as somebody who would be pushing back against the so-called conspiracy theorists and all that sort of stuff. So where do I sit now? I'd say that I much more skeptical. I often will answer questions by saying I can't rule anything out at this point.
Yeah, it's a tough position, I have to tell you, because once you are aware of what can be true, I mean, in this case, we had a technology that was a radical departure from the technologies we knew. And even the technologies we knew, the truth of them had not been properly aired. Mm-hmm. But this radically new technology deployed under false pretenses and then pushed towards people who stood to benefit not at all from it, like kids. Yeah. Yeah. That tells you that there's some force out there, whatever the nature of it, that is willing to do things that put healthy children in mortal danger for no benefit, something no rational society would contemplate.
Right.
Once you know that that can happen in a particular context, you have to ask yourself the question, is that a unique defect of pharma and its interaction with governance and science, or is this a more general pattern? And do I now have to be alert for this possibility in other places? And of course, you don't want to be somebody who's constantly looking for nefarious explanations for things that have mundane explanations. On the other hand, you know that you'd be foolish to assume that the mundane explanations had to be right because that was the correct bias in a prior world. Right. So, in some sense, I want to say, A, welcome, and B, I'm sorry. I'm not personally sorry. I don't think I did this to you, but I'm sorry that this happened to you, because what it means is from here on out, now that you're aware, nothing's easy. It just can't be. You have to do your homework. You're going to make errors. You're going to see stuff that you think indicates some sort of nefarious activity, and sometimes it will turn out not to be. Sometimes you'll miss nefarious activity because you're trying not to be reflexive. It's just not an easy position to be in.
No. Yeah, and part of my struggle, I think, was as I would phrase it, how do I keep both my feet on the ground in all of this? It's because it is destabilizing.
Yep.
Right. And so it's destabilizing, but I also then correspondingly knew that stress or anxiety would worsen my symptoms at the same time. So it's this weird sort of place that I had to both practically manage that anxiety by, moving on to other things or whatever, but also confront the fact that my worldview had been at minimum adjusted, if not, quite significantly, profoundly changed. So, one of the things you had just mentioned was the idea of a force. And I think a lot of people get caught up in the idea of you being conspiratorial by using that sort of phrasing. But how I've always, or at least how I now interpret what you mean by that, is you're describing a phenomenon in a simple sense, right? It's a series of different incentives and people and things that come together to create a certain direction in society or in particular places, right? And I think that in general, I was too naive to certain incentives. I was too naive that sociopathic and psychopathic people do exist. Like, obviously intellectually I knew they existed, but I didn't appreciate that those people do often get into places where they can wield disproportionate power. And then I honestly, one of the most concerning things that I learned about people around us in general is there's a lot of compliant people. And as you were alluding to, I think I would have been one of those people, because I would have, not in a sort of, you are a bad person sort of way. I just don't think I'm dispositionally, structured that way. But certainly in my mind, those people are not doing their part. Those people aren't reading the research or whatever the phrasing would be in my head. But as you've used the word too, the brown shirting of folks around me in general. Luckily, my closer friends are, I'd say, more normies, but they don't wear brown shirts. Let's just put it that way, fortunately. And that was also very helpful in my recovery process too, that it took a little bit of stress off. But yeah, even just, I didn't even tell my mom about it until 5+ months later.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Partly because I didn't want her to worry, right, as moms would do, but also because like the burden of her taking that on and sort of like managing it, that like I wasn't going to be worried about her response to me and that she was going to cast me away kind of thing. Yep. It was more so the stress of her reaction and the burden that she would kind of have to take on in conversations with other people. It didn't make sense. Like, fortunately, one of my siblings is a nurse, and we've been coming, we had all this classic sibling rivalry as we were younger, but over time we've gotten pretty close, and pretty much she was the only one that knew, other than a few other friends early on, for both practical and other reasons. And so yeah, it affected all those different relationships, and yeah, the worldview gets adjusted quite significantly when you go through those changes. And so it's also given me a lot of empathy for folks who have gone through either other types of health challenges that are completely ignored or gaslit, or non-health, but otherwise, experiencing things, seeing things, or whatever. I don't have to necessarily agree, believe, accept their premises. But as far as I'm concerned, at the very least, I'm going to hear them out. I'm going to give them the time. Obviously, you can't give the time to every single person that you ever come across, especially someone like you. But in principle, that's where I am. And I think I was much more, I was much less generous before, and I regret that, but I'm here now. So,
well, I think actually you've hit on the most important insight from all of this, which is that your social connections have to be robust to differences, even profound differences, even differences that, depending upon who's right, have life and death implications. The point is, if you're honestly trying to figure out what's going on and you're wrong, and the way you're wrong puts people in jeopardy, the right thing to do is to attempt to persuade you, and maybe you'll persuade me. Right. The wrong thing to do is to imagine that if your conclusion is incorrect and potentially harmful, that is a moral defect that you are displaying, because it isn't.
Right.
If your analytical process leads you to a conclusion, you're open to the possibility of changing it, and you act based on what you have concluded with the best tools at your disposal. Who can fault you for that? It's not a moral defect. It might be an analytical one, but that's it. And so anyway, I think the idea that, I mean, some of the other people I know who have stories, and frankly, some of them are worse than yours.
Totally. As I said, I'm very great. As bad as this was, I'm very grateful that it wasn't nearly as bad as many others have had it.
Many others.